through most of the film, even when I'm watching it, I think it's Quentin, except for what he says, because it's not very accurate, in terms of Quentin's personality. For instance, the idea that Quentin gave money anywhere. He just, it's just interesting what happens in life. I mean, I'm terrified of somebody, I've already lived through, because I was a Warhol superstar and because, I lived through the 60s, there's a lot of films that portray my milieu and my era, and it's always really frightening to watch it, because people, there's something, I don't know exactly what it is, but there's something about an inability of people to look at a period through the eyes of the period.
I mean, I think that's great. What we have you here, who are an authentic witness to all kinds of things. But there's something, it's as if the 80s was just a puffball skirt or something, that there's a single image that people take away from certain decades.
Right.
There's music that's constantly repeated. But actually, not everyone in the 60s was wearing a mini skirt and white boots and having a wonderful time. So there is a sort of a strange shorthand of history.
And this film also is very compacted. The screenwriter chose, and it's his right, he chose to sort of squish 1981 to 1999 into this very tight package,
And it's quite subtly done. I mean, those of you who really know what Quentin Crisp looked like will be able to tell from his hairstyles that they were changing. But that's the only real indication, unless you're kind of very up on who was president and stuff, that the time is changing. I mean, the music takes you there, and some of the fashions and things. But could we talk a little bit about, because Quentin lived on the Lower East Side,
absolutely,
and it's somewhere that was a great part of your career. And I mean, it's an extraordinary place. I mean, you talk about the number of people, the number of artists, poets, painters, playwrights, musicians, filmmakers. I mean, why? Why was the Lower East Side
It was a place for outsiders, which is why Quentin loved it so much. But before I go into that, I just want to say one thing, because it's weighing on me quite heavily. And that is, I think Quentin would be very, very, very unhappy to have the movie end on the note that he hated England, because he didn't hate England, okay? What was the truth was he would say, I don't like, the people in London don't like me very much, and I don't like them very much. Because for everything that he was able to really get over in his life, there's a lot he didn't get over. And I think none of us could possibly understand what his life was like, that everywhere he went in the 40s, really 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, that he would attract groups of people, 200 people at a time. And it wasn't because he was gay, because people didn't know he was gay. They didn't know what gay was. It was because he was different.
There's a very weird thing that so many people were touched by Quentin in many different ways.
Absolutely.
And you, almost anywhere in the world you go, if you say, I knew Quentin Crisp, someone will say, oh, really? Oh, well, I. And they always have something that they want to tell you about Quentin.
Right.
So it's very hard to get your story in sometimes. And I'm sure there are people out there who've seen his shows or done things.
Well, because he was a relator. He related to people. But I think that the salient element about Quentin is that when you have someone who's an outsider, and Quentin used to say to me all the time, Miss Arcade, people like you and I have to work hard at being accepted, because some people are just different. And human beings are pack animals. We're herd animals. We don't like outsiders, except when they're dead. So I think that Quentin lived his life and developed in this extraordinary way at the outskirts of society. And I also understand, Quentin was like one time older than me, like we were almost, he's born in 1908 and I'm born in 1950. So we were just I'm almost half as young as he was. So I always really knew from the beginning of my friendship with him was that I was going to learn how to be old from him. This was very important to me, and I'm 62 now, and I always tell people that I'm in the youth of my old age. And I would never squander 1 second, about being worried about being old. People are always like hiding their age, what's the point of that? What's the alternative? So at any rate, I think that like knowing Quentin as I did, and I was very lucky because I had him really pretty much all to myself because Americans are not interested in old people, I mean, now it's at a point that Americans aren't even interested in middle-aged people, They think they're going to eke out that imposture forever of being, 32 or something. So there are things that I didn't understand early on in my relationship with Quentin that he saw. But as soon as I was over 50, and I think people in the audience can relate to this who are over 50, all of a sudden everything becomes very clear. Everything that looked really complicated when you were still had all those hormones coursing through your body suddenly is not that complex. So I think that with Quentin, as he got older, I think the reality started to really weigh on him that because of his choices when he was young, that he had limited himself to a certain milieu that didn't match his intelligence, and that he got stuck with that, And I think that was a very weighty thing for him.
Because he did do an enormous amount of things. I mean, not just the film reviews, but I mean, his early work as an illustrator,
Yes.
and he wrote several books, and he did write short stories, and
He tapped. He taught tap dancing. I said, really? I said, Quentin, I can understand, how can you teach tap dancing if you can't dance? I would stay one tap ahead of the students. And I said to him, but what about illustrating? I said, I can understand that you could do certain other jobs and sort of, pretend to get by, but how could you be an illustrator without any talent? Because he'd say, I had no talent for any of these things. And I said, well, how can that be? And he'd say, you just call it art and do it badly.
so I mean, he was a very strange mixture of the infuriating and the wonderful, and he was very provocative.
Quentin and I would be on stage, and Quentin was very provocative. For instance, one day I said to him, we're on stage, and lots of young gay people as well as heterosexual people were in the audience. And I said, well, Quentin, now that they've finally stopped talking about Seinfeld, could we go back to talking about John Benet Ramsey? And John Benet Ramsey was the little beauty pageant girl who was killed, supposedly by her parents. And Quentin looks at me and he goes, I would have killed her myself. And I said, Quentin, how can you say that? I said, she was just a little girl. And he went, she was never a child. Why did her parents raise her to be such a terrible woman? And all of these kids in the audience were just freaked out because they would have never expected, they had like a politically correct idea of what someone like Quentin Crisp would be like. But the reality is that he was being both funny, but he was also making a very interesting point about what happens to little girls who are made to behave like 25-year-old fashion models, that they are made into women and they're no longer children. So it was always very interesting to see how he would interact. And one of the things that I have a problem with in the film is at no time did Quentin capitulate. I brought him to Vienna. We did a big show in Vienna. And, the first thing he said was, I said, well, he had never been on the continent, right? And I said, what do you think of me? In front of 1,700 people in Mozart's favorite theater. And I turned to Quentin and I say, well, I said, you've never been in Europe before. What do you think? And he goes, the continent is a mistake. And he would not back off from it at all. So in this film, Quentin, I did a lot of AIDS activism. I still do AIDS activism because AIDS is not over. And Quentin was against my activism. And I'd say to him, well, you don't understand. You don't understand the situation. And this was in the 80s and late 80s when the government wouldn't even talk about the fact that AIDS was happening. And Quentin would say, when I was young, syphilis was all the rage. But people didn't go running in and out of cathedrals. And he would also say, the older you get, Miss Arcade, the more out of context you become. So he didn't back off, and they used this as a conceit for the film that the reason why gay people in New York were angry with him was because of his remarks about AIDS, but it was really something else. It was because Quentin refused to stay or to enter into a gay ghetto. He had spent his entire life in the ghetto and refused to continue that. And he also believed, he would say to people, when people would say they had nothing in common with heterosexuals, Quentin would say, are you going to cut yourself off from 9/10 of the population? And then they'd say, but I have nothing in common with them. And he'd say, but you have everything in common with them except for your funny way of spending your evening. And at that point in the 80s, and it really did start with Michael Musto, who's one of our big gossip columnists. And I had gone to Mexico, and I returned from Mexico. I was gone a month, and Quentin called me, and whenever there was a problem, he would go, Miss Arcade must be called. And I had heard that he was looking for me, and I got in touch with him, and he was very upset because Michael Musto had written a column censoring Quentin because Quentin had been asked to write an article about Paris is Burning, the documentary on the voguing scene in Harlem. And apparently Michael Musto did not like the article that he wrote because Quentin had called the film a tragedy. And a few nights after I got back, we were at the Limelight, which is a club in New York. And Michael Musto came over to our table. I was sitting with Quentin. And Michael Musto was probably 35 at the time. And he kind of gave Quentin the cold shoulder. Now, Quentin was in his 80s. And I just couldn't believe that he was going to treat a person of Quentin's age and history in that way. And I said, Michael, I heard you wrote a horrible piece in the newspaper about Quentin. And he said, you should tell Quentin, with his back to him, you should tell Quentin that he shouldn't betray the gay community. And I said, oh, really, Michael? I said, what did he do? How did he betray the gay community? And Michael said, he called Paris is Burning a tragedy. And I said, well, Michael, when the protagonist in a film dies a third of the way through the movie, isn't that a tragedy? So, there was this clash, and I was kind of in the middle because I think because I'm immigrant Italian, I'm not afraid of old people. I have always been fascinated by old people. I'm fascinated by history. And Quentin lived quite apart. He would be invited to all of these events, but, people would sort of want to be seen with him for 3 minutes, and then they'd just leave him. And he'd be there with this thin coat in the middle of winter. And it was actually Michael Musto. The reason why Quentin and I ended up becoming such close friends was that Michael Musto had seen Quentin and I speaking at an event and had been eavesdropping. And afterwards he said to me, I've never heard Quentin Crisp have a real conversation with anybody. He's usually just doing his one-liners. And I said, but you go and see Madonna, you expect her to do her hits, right? You know? And I said this to Quentin. I told Quentin, and Quentin said, but people never speak to me, Miss Arcade. They're not with me, they're in my presence. They don't have conversations with me, Miss Arcade. They interview me.